Hello students, we were only a few slides short of finishing this lecture, so I'm going to record for something like 6 or 7 slides and have you view this, learn this content, and then there are some corresponding videos that go with it. So we've been talking about the idea of overfishing. We've talked about reducing bycatch. We've talked about trying to better monitor pirate vessels so that we can get them out of water so they're not fishing illegally. I want to turn our attention now to the idea of capacity migration. The idea of capacity migration stems from the concern that there are just too many boats fishing. If there are too many boats fishing, we have too much harvest and a lot of competition for fish species. So the idea of capacity migration is to address the idea of too many boats and move to the idea of having the optimal number of boats. So again, goal, ensure that we have the appropriate number of vessels fishing. So there's got to be some optimal number. How can we get to that appropriate or optimal number of vessels that are fishing in the water? Of course, if we can get to the appropriate number of vessels, the appropriate number of boats, then that's going to help us promote the idea of this sustainable harvest. So that's where we're going with this idea of capacity migration. Create sustainable harvest, promote sustainable harvest by having the right number of boats on the water. That's all we're talking about. Of course, we've been talking a little bit about the impact of overfishing on local food supply. So we have to keep in mind there are some clear developmental connections here that tie into economics, that when we have the sustainable harvest, we're going to protect local food supplies. So we've seen videos already, Sierra Leone, Guinea, where fishermen were unable to go catch the amount of fish that they were used to catching. That means there's going to be a lot less fish available. Keep in mind that affects the local food supply, and it's also going to impact prices. The idea here is that we have to determine the sustainable catch for each year. And I'm going to refer to that as a quota. So when I talk about a quota, I'm saying that somebody has sat down and figured out what is the amount of fish that we can catch sustainably. So we need to determine the sustainable catch for each year, and we're going to set a quota. We need to set that quota accurately, because if we're not accurate, if we're wrong, then we're really not going to get a sustainable yield. We're not going to have reproduction that we need. So establishing a quota, and my guess is that scientists have to do this. The economists can be at the table, but the economists aren't really going to have a whole lot to say here. This has got to be based on sound science. One thing that economists talk about a lot with respect to overfishing is this idea of individual transferable quotas. So this is one approach to this optimal number of boats, this capacity migration that we're talking about. Individual transferable quotas are often referred to as ITQs, and I'll be using that abbreviation, and there may be articles or videos that refer to them as ITQs, and that's a lot easier to say than individual transferable quota. So ITQs. We might also see it referred to as individual fishing quotas. Now, it's really transferable quotas. That term transferable is key, and I'm going to talk about that idea of transferability, but you might see them referred to as individual fishing quotas. But again, those might not literally be the same thing, because when we talk about ITQs, we're talking about quota shares that are transferable. So underline that word, transferable. ITQs are simply a method for privatizing the fish commons. So we're going to privatize the fish commons through ITQs. Now again, let's make sure we understand what we're talking about. We already agree that these fisheries are common pools. They're common resources, in fact, open access resources. So we have a common pool problem, just like we do if we have land and people are overgrazing their sheep on the land. Well, remember we talked about one way of solving that problem was to cut up the land into individual chunks. We cut up the land into individual chunks, and then that's your private land, and all of a sudden your incentives have changed. So this is the same kind of approach, privatizing the fish commons. This requires that the total catch be set by government. And that's really important to understand because a lot of people don't understand the idea of privatizing the commons. They're like, wait, you're just going to give fishermen the ownership of some share of the catch? That's not exactly what's going on. Understand that government controls the total yield because they're establishing the total catch. Then we'll divide it up, but somebody's got to set the overall amount. In that way, government controls the total harvest, and that total harvest can go up, that total harvest can go down based on what the government feels needs to happen for sustainability. So government is controlling the total harvest by setting this total catch, the total yield that we're going to have, and then chopping it up and giving it out. That's the idea of privatizing. So what's going to happen here is that fishermen will be assigned a share of the total catch. That's the privatizing part. Fishermen will be assigned a share of the total catch, and it belongs to them. How do we do this fairly? Well, normally when I see discussions of ITQs, they're looking at past yields. You can't just divide it up equally, right? Because you've got some bigger operations and some smaller operations. And so bigger operations that have been fishing historically more and that have had bigger yields in the past, they should get a bigger share. So there's got to be some way of dividing it up fairly, and basing it on your past harvests or your past yields is one way of doing that. The key thing here is that these shares are transferable. And that's why I said that individual transferable quotas may not be the same as individual fishing quotas. Transferability is the thing that economists are focusing on here. This is a very important part of establishing efficiency. So they're transferable. So what that means is they can be bought and they can be sold. So understand, transferable quotas means you can buy them, you can sell them. So as a fisherman, you would have two choices. You could use your quota, or you can sell it to somebody else. So you can use your quota and then harvest fish and sell them, or you can just sell the quota. So what we're really talking about is fishermen being able to make a decision on what makes sense for them. Should I use it? If I use it, I go out in my boat, I catch fish, I sell those fish to some fish supplier, maybe a middleman, or I just avoid fishing altogether and I sell my share of the quota to someone else. Let's think through a scenario. Suppose I'm going to make X dollars from the fish that I sell. So I use my quota, I go out and harvest fish, and I'm going to make X dollars when I catch the fish and sell them to the middleman. So I'm going to make X dollars. But do you agree that X, the amount of money that I'm going to make, is a function of my operation, right? X is completely determined by my operation, what I'm doing on my boat. So one thing that drives this is how low are my costs, right? The costs that I have for fishing are certainly going to affect how much money I'm going to make. See the connection there? So X is not external to me. It's endogenous. My costs, the size of my boats, how efficient I am at catching fish drives X, what I'm going to make when I sell the fish. Now, suppose that I'm going to make Y dollars by simply selling my quota. You see what we're setting up here. I have a decision. I can make X if I fish myself, and I can make Y if I simply sell the quota. It's obvious how I'm going to behave. If Y dollars is greater than X dollars, then do we all agree I have an incentive to sell my quota? Because that means I'm going to make more by simply selling off my quota than fishing myself. So if Y dollars is greater than X dollars, then does everyone agree I've got the incentive to sell off my quota, which means I'm not doing the fishing? But of course, if Y dollars is less than X dollars, then I should retain the quota. I'm going to make less by selling off the quota. I'm going to make more, taking into account my costs, by harvesting the fish myself and selling them, taking into account my costs. Of course, I need to note that people can also just rent out their quota. So you might be thinking, well, what if I want to sell it this year, but I don't want to sell it permanently? You can sell it off for 1 year. In other words, they can just be rented out. So it doesn't have to be a decision you make permanently where you're no longer a fisherman, you've sold your quota, and you can never get it back. You can do the same kind of thing by renting, but it's still going to be the same decision, right? X dollars versus Y dollars. Clearly, my decision, if I'm faced with this scenario, is going to depend on the efficiency of my operation. How efficiently do I harvest fish? How efficient is my operation? Am I a high-cost fisherman? Maybe my equipment's really old. Maybe I'm not very efficient. My boat's really slow. Or am I a low-cost fisherman? Maybe I have a good speedy boat. I have really efficient processes. So again, efficiency comes into play here. If you have a high cost structure, higher than average, let's say, if your costs are relatively high, maybe it's because you have an older boat, older equipment, and you're just not harvesting as many fish per hour, right? So maybe your equipment's cheaper, but you're just not that productive for every hour that you're out on the water. That might give you a higher cost structure. If you're in this situation where you have a higher cost structure, would you be more likely to sell your quota or rent? Or would you be more likely to retain it and use it yourself? Well, think through that. What's going to be more likely for you? Do you agree you'd be more likely to sell or rent? Think through the scenario. If you're higher cost, what happens to X? Higher costs means X goes down. In theory, what this suggests is that the more efficient operations will be the ones buying the ITQs, because the less efficient operations will be the ones selling the ITQs. So do you see how we might be getting enhanced efficiency here, driven by who chooses to sell and who chooses to buy? So in theory, less efficient operations will sell, right? If you're high cost, you're more likely to sell. If you're low cost, you're likely to buy. If these ITQ programs are well monitored, they can prevent overfishing. Now again, I said if they are well monitored. If we simply just pass out quotas and we don't do any supervising, we don't do any monitoring, then this is really not going to solve any problems. So understand that. It's got to be implemented hand in hand with effective monitoring. In theory, what's going to happen is it's going to result in a lower cost of bringing fish to market. So in theory, we're going to have a lower cost of bringing fish to market. Again, make sure you understand where I got that conclusion from. The high-cost fishermen are the ones more likely to sell their quotas or rent their quotas. The lower-cost, more efficient fishermen are the ones more likely to buy. So think about what's happening. Quotas are flowing in the direction of the lower-cost fishermen. Individual transferable quotas are not without their criticisms. We've just talked about the benefits, right? The benefits are we have fewer boats on the water, and it's going to be the more efficient operations with lower costs being the ones on the water because they're buying quotas from the high cost, less efficient operations. But that doesn't make this a panacea. There are certainly things we can be concerned about with ITQs. First, some people are going to point to the idea that this seems like giving a public resource to private individuals. And that's understandable, right? We're giving fishermen a share of the catch from the ocean. Well, doesn't the ocean kind of belong to all of us? That's how people think. So this is going to have a lot of resentment because we're giving a public resource or access to that public resource to private individuals. It's also possible that the ITQs favor larger and more modern operations. Again, why would that be? What's going to be true about the costs of larger operations? What's going to be true about the cost of these modern operations? Well, sure, their boats are more expensive and their equipment is more expensive, but those are fixed costs, right? We need to think about the variable costs. And once you've already bought your boat, right, fixed costs, we don't need to think about that. Think about the variable cost of harvesting fish. You can get more done in an hour with the same number of workers if you're a more modern operation. So we're going to see quotas potentially flow to the larger, more modern operations. Some people feel then that this focuses on profit and not preservation. That what's going to happen is we're going to have larger fishermen becoming more and more profitable. Well, I've got in parentheses, does this concern us as economists? Are we worried about the profitability and how much the different fishermen are going to make? Or do we really care about the efficient number of boats and making sure that we have an efficient harvest? I'm guessing we care more about efficient harvest and the efficient number of boats than we're really are focused about profitability. Now, you're going to learn more about ITQs as you watch videos on this topic and as you read some articles. So you need to do what's required for homework and be ready for a potential quiz next class period. So be sure to take some notes on these topics and be ready for anything I might ask you. ITQs is a simple topic. So if you have any questions, let me know. And of course, as I said, you're going to explore this idea more. Thanks so much, guys. Have a lovely day.